So welcome to the panel, Utopian Thinking and the Transformation of Environment. As in every panel that has a bit of a philosophical ambition, we're going to discuss the big questions. Let's start by defining the terms that we're going to use. So utopia, as you probably know, is not, it's quite a new word, actually, only created in the 16th century by the English social philosopher and Enlightenment humanist Sir Thomas More. And the word is constructed from two Greek words which originally mean no place. So not exactly a good place as we would think, although the Greek word for good place would sound exactly the same. So it's a bit of a play on that already in that original work. But of course, we think about utopia as imagination of some kind of social organization which is considerably better than ours, ideal social organization, ideal society. And what is also characteristic of utopia is the imagination that humans could control all the variables of such a society and a system. A classic modern optimism about abilities of human rationality and the abilities to control the nature. And of course, this kind of utopian thinking and the ideologies that were born out of it, we can think of socialism and communism, but of course also capitalism and the idea of unlimited growth, have affected lives of millions of people and altered the environment irreversibly. So today, probably we live in a bit of a post-ideological and maybe post-utopian, really, society when it doesn't have such an appeal. We don't really believe anymore in progress and the ability of people to create a wonderful, ideal society. And rather, actually, we tend to think a lot about dystopia and even apocalypse, as our keynote speaker was talking on Tuesday. But he said young people really like to think about apocalypse today, but I think everyone likes to think about apocalypse today. It's a bit of an appealing idea. Let's die together at the same time. So, you know, no one has to die earlier. But paradoxically, with the climate change and the environmental catastrophes that we are facing, we might actually need very creative and brave new thinking, maybe utopian thinking again. So in this panel, we will think, is it possible to revive utopian thinking beyond those ideologies of the past? Or should we actually revive those ideologies of the past? And can we think beyond the idea of the unlimited resourcefulness of nature, the unlimited nature? And actually, maybe we should start realizing that it is impossible for humanity and nature to live in harmony together, and maybe we should radically rewild the whole planet to somehow counter the damaging effects of human activity. So this is an interdisciplinary panel, and we will talk about big-scale questions, and we expect from you big-scale questions as well to us. We'll think about philosophical basis for our thinking about utopia in relation to environment, about social coexistence in the face of climate change, of a critique of past ideologies and past utopias, and the relationship between humanity and nature. And I'm very happy to introduce the panelists that I invited here today, all very promising young scholars, maybe not so young anymore, but definitely very exciting thinkers. Egidijus Mardosas from Vilnius University, Dimovska from Democracy Institute at Central European University in Budapest, and Maria Szczygielska from Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. So I will introduce you a little bit more one at a time. So we will go as a classic panel style, just everyone giving their talks, and then we're gonna have a space for questions. So I would like to introduce, first of all, the first speaker, Egidijus Mardosas, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at Vilnius University, Department of Philosophy. currently pursuing a research project on the Anthropocene and eco-Marxist social thought. He's the author of Revolutionary Aristotelianism and Ideology, McIntyre on Practical Reason and Virtue by Bloomsbury, 2024. He was awarded Emerging Scholar 2022 award by the New Directions in the Humanities Research Network. And he was also a visiting scholar here at the University of Vienna Anthropocene Network. So Egidijus will talk about utopian reasoning, and can we think about utopia in ways that take into account the unruliness of nature? So here you go, Egidijus, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rasa, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful panel. It's really nice to be speaking about utopia, and I want to raise those questions that Rasa thought maybe we shouldn't, but maybe we should again. So how we could imagine ideal society, good society in terms of climate change. And I was struggling a little bit what actually to say today, because in recent years I was involved in a very theoretical and very philosophical project, so I was looking ways to come down to earth a little bit and talk in more practical examples. But then I somehow realized that actually, well, a lot of questions we've been raising in these discussions are exactly the questions that have been raised by the Marxist socialist tradition. So, for example, we talked a lot about, we heard in different panels a lot about how capitalism is a problem and with the climate change. And also at the very beginning of this conference, the RECET director asked this question, so what are we transforming to? So I think this is the socialist traditions always raise this question, so what are we transforming to? How the post-capitalist socialist world could look like. So I want today to look at some different ideas, utopian projects, or how such society could look like, and evaluate them from the kind of ecological perspective. But before doing that, I want just to say a few things about utopia, because I find it very interesting that in recent, decades, let's say, Marxist socialist thought actually embraces a lot utopianism, which might be quite surprising given this ambivalent relationship with utopian reasoning from the Marxist tradition. So, for example, American science fiction writer, socialist writer Kim Stanley Robinson has this fantastic essay who remarks on utopia in age of climate change. He published that maybe 6 or 7 years ago, in which he basically says that utopia has gone from being a somewhat minor literary problem to a necessary survival strategy. It's a very interesting claim by which he says that we need to daring thinking, we need to imagine good futures to break away from this capitalism realism, also to break away from these catastrophic narratives that Rasa mentioned in the introduction, and actually to have a positive scenario, where are we going to? And for that we need to reactivate utopian reasoning. Very similar things have been said by a Marxist geographer Mike Davis in a very, very famous essay that sparked a lot of debates how eco-socialism transition could be imagined. That essay was called Who Will Build the Ark? And here Davis basically says we need to start to think like Noah, meaning we have to think about survival and rebuilding human societies. And he ends that essay by saying, well, we need to return to utopianism. We don't need to be realists, we need to be utopians, he says. And I would like to quote him, because I think it's a very curious thing he's saying about utopia. He says that, I'm quoting, only a return to explicitly utopian thinking can clarify the minimal conditions for the preservation of human solidarity in face of converging planetary crisis. So utopia clarifies only minimal conditions, can offer only some basic minimal starting points from which to reinvent our coexistence. But he means this. What he means by this is that we need to basically, suspend all the assumptions we have, all the political, ecological assumptions we have that tie us to the present, and then to completely reinvent the future world. So that's why utopianism becomes so necessary. I tend to agree with him, but then the question becomes that we need to also critically evaluate our utopian legacy and see what actually survives and what is good, what can be adopted and built from when responding to the climate change and imagining an ecological, or let's say eco-socialist future. So now I want to go to the main point of my talk, which is to discuss a few different ideas how the post-capitalist world would look like. And I want to say that in recent years, we are reliving a debate that happened at the end of 19th century. When I say we, I mean Marxist, socialist tradition, people working in this tradition. So I'm not meaning everyone. Maybe you will say no, we're thinking completely differently. But what the Marxist thinking, I think we're reliving this debate that happened in the 19th century. So I want to introduce this old debate and then explain why I think we are repeating it. So that debate happened between Edward Bellamy and William Morris. So at the end of 19th century, these two authors wrote their utopian novels that described a post-capitalist utopian world. And they were completely different. So Edward Bellamy, I'll start with Bellamy. He gives us this narrative, which kind of in a nutshell is like this. So capitalism develops technologies, prepares this incredible means of production, to use the Marxist expression. We are able to produce a lot cheaply, quickly. We have big factories, production is rationalized and so on. So he says, well, capitalism prepares this incredible means of production, these technological possibilities. We should just take them and use for the collective benefit. And so his narrative is how it's not a narrative of revolution, but of democratic transformation in which everyone realized that it's better to use these technological capacities for the benefit of everyone. And then all the factories, all the means of production are taking over for collective control. And this creates this automated post-work society of abundance. So what his idea of the post-capitalist society is a society where most of work is automated. Very little necessary work is still left, of course, but technologies prepare us for this society of abundance. There's a centralized production and distribution systems. There are no money, of course, everything is free, and people are living in these leisurely lifestyles with material abundance, which is delivered by these incredible technological possibilities that capitalism was preparing for us. So that's Bellamy's narrative. And I think his logic is kind of realization of the logic that starts with the beginning of modernity, with Baconian program of just subjecting nature for rational control, and that will deliver us material necessity. So the program whose main assumption is that human freedom rests on material abundance. Let's rationally control our interactions, productive interactions with nature, to create material abundance, and then we will have a free society. So that's the basic logic. Now, William Morris was horrified by this. Morris was a libertarian socialist, and he wrote a review of Bellamy's novel, and immediately responded with his own utopia, which was called News from Nowhere. Also, I forgot to tell that Bellamy's book was called Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. So he was describing the year 2000 to the audience of 1887. Well, we lived through the year 2000, so fortunately, Bellamy was a bit off. Yeah, so Morris. And Morris writes very interesting, very curious review to this book. And he basically says, well, Mr. Bellamy, you forget to complete your revolution. You only made half of the revolution. And you forgot that you cannot have an alternative society with the old means of production. You have to, if you want to have a completely different society, you have to also radically transform the means of production to reinvent completely new means of production. So you cannot just simply take over the technological legacy of capitalism and build communism on top of that. And he writes his own novel, which is called A News from Nowhere. So Nowhere is a play of the term utopia, in which the story is completely different. So it's not a story of a peaceful transition, but a story of a very long conflict in which people are finally victorious and they win against capital, and they take over all these means of production, and what they do, they completely disband it, they transform it, and reinvent society on a very different basis. Now, Morris was very ecologically concerned thinker, so for him the problem was always the pollution, the environmental degradation that comes with big industrial cities. So he wants us to reimagine a society in which production is very decentralized, smaller. He calls his novel, the subtitle of the novel is Epoch of Rest. So people shake this kind of productivist, capitalist ethic, and they just enjoy their lives. They find pleasure in doing things with their own hands, so arts and crafts flourish. People like to produce things for themselves. Big industrial cities are changed, and people are kind of dispersed more equally around natural environments, and he thinks a lot how to reintegrate human society in nature. Now, the curious thing about Morris's novel that it looks and it sometimes is interpreted as this kind of pre-capitalist romantic vision. Because curiously, there is very little technology in that, and the way he describes it, it looks like some kind of pre-capitalist agrarian society, which is not really correct if you look very carefully, because at one point in that novel, Morris talks about immensely improved technology, and also the various essays he wrote at the same time, he also talks about the factories of the future. So he's concerned about the production, but unfortunately in that novel it reads that he wants us to return to some kind of pre-capitalist world. But as other scholars of Morris mentioned this, and I agree with them, he's more concerned with the alternative technology. Unfortunately, he's not able to imagine that. What he's able to imagine is just to describe ways of living that sounds very agrarian, pre-capitalist way of living, but the whole question of the alternative, that is the question that he raises, and I think this is the most important question of his critique, is that you cannot imagine an alternative society without reimagining completely different means of production. Interestingly, I think Morris's Morris's idea was marginalized, and more socialist tradition took over Bellamist logic. I will call it the Bellamist logic. Took the Bellamist logic, with mean just, let's advance this technological basis, and that will create a society of abundance, communist society of abundance. And I think now in recent years, we see the same debate happening again. And I think we see a revival of Bellamist's position, which is might seem quite curious given climate change, but it is in the context of the climate change we see a revival of the Bellamist reasoning. So what I have in mind is, well, for example, left accelerationist thinkers. For example, an acceleration manifesto published in 2013 by Nick Sirnichik and Alex Williams, and then they wrote some books together. And the main thesis of that manifesto is that they say a neoliberal technological base is not something to smash, but something to use to catapult us into utopian future. Basically, they're saying the problem we have is not a technological problem. We have all the technological means to solve climate crisis. It's just political problem. We just need to take over our technological capabilities, use them rationally, and we will deal with all the negative technological consequences. We can transition easily to renewable energy, and we can continue this line of progress that goes with modernity, progress of abundance, of rational control of nature to deliver us abundance. So their ideal is also fully automated society of material abundance. Probably the most popular example of this Bellamist thinking comes from Aaron Bastani, whose book probably most of you know. It has a fantastic title. That book is called Fully Automated Luxury Communism. It became very, very famous, at least my experience with the younger students. For them, it was a kind of a gateway to the more radical thinking. I myself saw many reading groups in Vilnius where students were discussing this book. So his idea is very simple. Let's automate the world by taking over our technologies for the collective use. Let's get rid of polluting technologies. We have all the technologies we need to solve all the problems, and then we'll have this automated society of abundance. He's, of course, very aware of all the negative environmental issues, like, for example, even with the transition to renewable energy. So we had a panel on a keynote speak on lithium, for example. So he's aware of that, but his solution is actually, let's mine asteroids. So let's transform all our industrial plans to space, and then they will save Earth. Or we can continue the same extractivist practices, but this time mining asteroids, not Serbia. And we have more examples of this. I can continue. There is a fantastic book. Again, I just read the title. I will not discuss its contents, but I think it summarizes the logic of it. So the title of a book by Lee Phillips, where the book is called Austerity, Ecology, and the Collapse Porn Addicts. And the subtitle is A Defense of Growth, Progress, Industry, and Stuff. So, I have to finish. Okay, then I'll be very, very quick. So I think this is a wrong kind of utopianism, and I'll try to explain why. There is a reason why it's so famous, because it reacts to certain problems in the ecological thought. And because a lot of ecological thinking was based on the complete rejections of modern industrial societies and kind of offering us to return to pre-modern lives or even pre-agricultural lives. There are various suggestions coming from anarcho-primitivists to, for example, more recently, so-called deep green resistance. So it's a bunch of authors who basically call us to launch a war against industrial civilization, to smash all this technological legacy, kill a few billion people in the progress, and return to the pre-agricultural lifestyles. So this Bellamist logic is a reaction to this kind of ecological thinking, but they swing to a completely opposite direction and say, well, we can have the same industrialist, extractivist societies, but this time miraculously without the negative ecological effects. And in reaction to this, I think we have a return to the questions that Morris raises, and I have to finish, so I'll be very quick, but maybe I can continue in the discussion. So a lot of Marxists now learn the lessons of all these post-growth, degrowth debates, and rethinking post-capitalist future on these lines. So a concrete example I have is very famous young Japanese Marxist Kohei Saito, who published a book, Marx in the Anthropocene, last year. He's a big superstar in Japan. His book on Marx was a bestseller. Can you imagine? A book on Marx is a bestseller. And in the book Marx in the Anthropocene, which is the English translation of the Japanese book, he basically says, he wants to convince us that Marx rejected this Bellamist logic at the end of his life, and that Marx is a post-growth communist. And he says that Marxists came to realize that capitalist development no longer prepare the grounds for the eco-socialist future. And he says the same thing that Morris says, that we need to reinvent means of production if we want to reinvent society, if we want to create an eco-socialist society. Of course, this becomes a big question how to imagine that. We see that Morris has kind of failed to do that. And I think at the moment we are just raising the questions, but the question is very important. And just final quote, coming from the French philosopher Pierre Charbonnier, when he comes from a socialist tradition as well, and he says, we need to reinvent freedom, to reinvent progress without this assumption of material abundance coming from the subjective nature to our control. So how it might look like, I don't know, but maybe looking into various utopian traditions, as Davis suggests, is a way to proceed, but then we have to be careful what kind of utopias we are reactivating. So that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Egidijus. What I'm learning, I will not pose a question, I'm just bring some ideas maybe for the discussion. What I'm hearing is that neither technological advancement, nor the idea, of course, of natural abundance that's long in the past will save us, but we will always need to find a political agreement about exactly what kind of course the society will take. And it's very interesting if we can actually look still through the glasses of Marxism, when Marxism seems to be such a discredited idea in a big part of the world. So I would like to introduce our second speaker, who will precisely actually talk about a piece of literature that was a dystopia aimed to criticize the socialist system, Yugoslav socialist utopia. So I would like to introduce Eva Dimovska, who is, yes, a round of applause for Eva. She's a postdoctoral fellow working on a project, Utopia and Nationalism in the Formation of Socialist Yugoslavia, within the Democracy in East Central European Utopianism Research Group at the CU Democracy Institute in Budapest, funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. So she has a background in comparative literature and gender studies, and has worked on modernist literature for her PhD thesis at CU. And yes, I already presented shortly what she will be talking about. So Eva, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rasa, and thank you for the invite. So as Rasa said, this presentation is part of a larger project that examines the connections between utopia and nationalism in former Yugoslavia. Utopia has had different meanings in the different phases of Yugoslavia, following, of course, the various political and social cultural systems that existed in Yugoslavia. In this larger project, I have a hypothesis that differentiates between three meanings of utopia. First, I look at the pan-Slavic concept as a utopian notion in the first years, from the formation of what was then the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes in 1918 until the end of the Second World War. And after 1945, with the rise of Titoism and the new social federation, the new Yugoslavia, I see the ascent of Yugoslav socialism, first as a utopian ideal, but then as soon as the late 40s until the dissolution of Yugoslavia in the early 90s, there's also a tendency of critiquing Yugoslav socialism through dystopian and utopian imagery. So today I wanted to talk about a 1961 novel called Sneg I led, in English Snow and Ice, from writer Erich Koch. And this novel belongs to the third category here. So it aims at criticizing the failure of socialism through, as you will see, utopian and dystopian imagery. First, just a few words shortly about the writer. Erich Koch was a Jewish Serbian writer. He was born in Sarajevo in 1913. Then he graduated from the University of Belgrade's Law School in 1935. In 1934, he joined first revolutionary labor movement and then the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. As this was in the period of the kingdom, in 1936, he was sentenced by the Court for the Protection of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in Belgrade as a communist to life imprisonment. The situation changed, of course, with the war. So in 1941, he joined the resistance movement, the National Liberation Army of Yugoslavia. By the end of the Second World War, he came out of the war as a colonel, and he was honored with a lot of commemorative medals by the partisans. And following this basically line of events, he assumed a significant role in the establishment of the new society after the end of the war, especially when it came to rebuilding Yugoslavia's cultural and literary scene. So basically at one point he was even the Ministry of Culture and Education. He had a lot of significant roles. He was a diplomat. And his works were translated into languages around Yugoslavia and also the neighboring countries. He has maybe some short stories translated into English, but he was an important figure after the war. So basically he was a career writer, you could say that. And but he had his traumatic experiences with of course, the regime from the kingdom. And after that, after the publication of his first collection of short stories after the war, he was called in by the Communist Party and he was told that he's being too radical. So here he formed a strategy basically of writing satirical works. And this work that I'm talking about today, Snow and Ice, together with a few other works, is considered as a satirical work, and he has this role as a satirist. During his long literary life, he died in Belgrade in 2010 at the age of 97. He maintained this position of a respected writer, and this is how he used utopian, dystopian, apocalyptic imagery to critique the society he was living in. Utopianism, following Miguel Abencer's approach, in a broad way understood as the education of a desire for being and living otherwise, has proven productive in the last few decades, even resurrected from its deathbed, some would say, as a theoretical and methodological frame and reimagining and working for a climate-changed world. Here I have in mind recent works such as utopian scholars as Matthias Thaler, whose work No Other Planet, Utopian Visions for a Climate-Changed World, or then Gregory Clay's Utopianism for a Dying Planet. They're both published in 2022, and they stress the need for reimagining sociability beyond capitalism in a world that is ravaged by climate catastrophes. So this 1961 novel about Yugoslav socialism that is situated in a new ice age might seem not so relevant to today's crisis of global warming, but it's a work that clings to utopian hope through a critique of anti-sociability in a time of unprecedented catastrophic climate events. And these unprecedented catastrophic events are the direct consequence of human behavior. So as I'm going to quote here a recent study of this work, Monja Jovic points out in her study Utopia and Dystopia in Serbian prose in the second half of the 20th century. This novel captures the failure of socialism, and it transforms it into a world apocalypse from which there is no escape. The human race has missed all of its chances, and socialism was the last of them. With its betrayal, the world sinks into an irreversible entropy of the Ice Age. The novel, in a way, aims, as a socialist realist novel, doesn't really escape that genre. It aims to represent the collective. There's not too much psychological development of individual characters, but they're meant to be treated as types and representatives of social classes. At the type of this social hierarchy, we have the Director General of the Directorate for Public Transport. He's, in a way, a main character. His name is Stojan Plechaš. And his fall from grace, first of all, the loss of his social standing that comes as a result from the loss of his position as a Director General, is the main plot line of the novel. And this loss of status is best exemplified through the representation of the married couple. There's a married couple called Krekic, who forms another ladder in the social strata. This writer, Krekic, and his wife are representatives of the pseudo-intellectual class. They're opportunists who try to basically keep all of their existing privileges with the coming of the Ice Age. They organize a kind of monthly gatherings, like a social salon, through which Koch uses this trope to represent all of his characters. When they basically invite people of status that will increase their own social standing, and they discuss topics from literature, politics. And you can see here the stratification of the social classes, their differences, and this kind of image is more emphasized in the salons. Here, for example, we meet a couple of other characters. One important one is a poet, so there's a lot of mocking of Koch's contemporaries here. He's a sarcastic presence, but he holds himself to be like the conveyor of this morally right opinion in this environment. He, for example, with the start of the Ice Age, laments after the primitive man, one from the Ice Age and the eternal snow, still unburdened by the burden of our culture, free from social norms, a human man, naked and not restrained. And the irony, of course, lies in the fact that with the arrival of the Ice Age, this will not bring back this naive, primitive, and honest time that the poet has in mind, but rather will emphasize the social differences. Across the street from this mansion of this couple, we can see Tomic, a poor civil servant, in his tiny basement flat, who, together with his wife, who is very unhappy with his lack of ambition that has led them to that basement flat, they can only bear witness to these gatherings from outside. They can never join them. The novel actually opens with a short scene between the main character, the general director, and the civil servant. We don't know exactly at this point what's happening, but they have a conversation about something. Tomic is asking for a favor. Later, the reader realizes that he's asking him for an upgrade of his socially owned basement flat that the wife is unhappy with. But the general director doesn't have a lot of patience. He tells him immediately that he should take care of his own troubles. He doesn't have time for that kind of conversation. And what he emphasizes is that this civil servant should understand that, this is a quote, "Life is ruled by cold, sometimes harsh laws, the icy logic of development and the cold laws of existence," that, as you can read in the morning headlines in the newspapers. So from the very beginning, as we're shown through this direct reciting of newspaper titles, the novel paints a picture of a society where the cold rules all spheres of human relation: political, cultural, economic, and most importantly, perhaps, interpersonal. Therefore, the dystopian and satiric critique of this failure of the socialist ideal is achieved here through kind of a literalization of a metaphor that is equally reflected in the cold, impersonal, and distant tone of the prose. And what was supposed to be, firstly, an insignificant blip, a last reminder of the weather before the start of the spring, turns into a proper ice age that is predicted to last for another 20,000 years. But before long, this kind of image of that humans are responsible for this, that they've brought this upon themselves, becomes very prevalent in society, and most of all among the lowest classes that keep going to restaurants during the day to keep warm, and they're all gathered in tiny rooms in their ground floor apartments. In their basement apartments become now the most valuable possessions. Here's, for example, a quote that summarizes this. "One war had just ended, and already in the newspapers everywhere, we had the opportunity to hear about the cooling of the previously cordial and warm atmosphere between the Allies, about the cold reception with which the proposal for peaceful settlement of disputed issues was met, and also about the spread of the Cold War, which threatens to engulf the whole world. There wasn't a day that we didn't hear on the radio about the icy atmosphere that prevailed at a conference, about the iron-and-ice curtains, about the icebergs of the Cold War." Haven't we ourselves so many times complained that we were received very coldly by an elder? We were greeted coldly by an acquaintance we tried to turn to help for, and coldly received by a friend we counted on the most. We protect ourselves against intimate friendship, honest conversations. We have separated ourselves from each other with our titles and positions. We treat each other in a cold official manner, and we punish any intimacy and familiarity in official relations. So you can see here from this that basically the human world is inhabited by the cold in all the spheres, and also the tone. This is how the prose is being told. This is the entire style of the novel. And interestingly, although the events are depicted here take place in Belgrade, so it's a Belgrade place novel, the coming of the Ice Age is not only limited to Yugoslavia, it's a global phenomenon. The narrator, for example, explains how in this new world, borders are swiftly erected, as if people are hoping to stop the blowing of the cold wind with building walls. But in this new situation, the developed West and the North want to escape to warmer places in the uncivilized South. One notable example here is a commentary on the Belgian Congo, a Belgian colony in Central Africa, that in 1960 became the Republic of Congo, where Belgians wanted to go in large numbers in this new situation with the coming of the Ice Age. Here's the narrator's take on the situation. This is another quote. "When they were having a nice and good time in their Brussels, preparing for their exhibitions, the last thing on their mind was moving to the jungle." As Monjajovic points out here, Koch is obviously referring to the Expo 58, the 1958 Brussels World Fair. That was the first major world fair after the Second World War, where the Belgian hosts set up a live display of people from Congo, a kind of a human zoo, where black men, women, and children in so-called native conditions were laid on for the amusement and education of white Europeans. And this is a rare critique of this kind of critique of Western colonialism and imperialism in a Yugoslav work of that time. So as the novel progresses here, society becomes quickly very different. The Krekiches still have their gatherings, but now they invite guests so they can keep the air warm. Yes. And in the outside world, food and electricity don't exist anymore. This general director loses his position, so basically he's not a wanted presence. And probably the most radical comment on the bureaucracy of socialism here is when these hosts, together with the poet, they come up with a proclamation that is supposed to fix the way in which humans die, to introduce order to human dying. So basically this proclamation that decides who gets to live or die literalizes those differences that always exist in the social world and that are very pronounced through the salons, but now they basically get to determine who lives and dies in the new Ice Age world. So, just a short conclusion, because I'm running out of time. As a representation of a dystopian apocalyptic age, this novel is meant to critique the failure of socialism as a utopian ideal, but it's also a didactic novel. It warns against the dangers of existing social differences and what their solidification will eventually lead to, the collapse of social order and the eradication of the human race. So the disappointment with socialism as a classless world is behind the apocalyptic coming of this Ice Age, but it's supposed to serve as a warning of this will happen if we don't somehow change the world that we live in. So in a way, it keeps this utopian hope, and this is probably most pronounced in the last few scenes the last few pages that are rewriting of the first scene where this general director and the poor civil servant who is looking for a new apartment. So in this rewriting, the general director actually listens to him and even offers his own flat. And immediately after that, the spring comes and takes over. And this kind of, the apocalyptic scenario would have never happened in that scenario. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, for your talk. And I think it's so interesting now to think about how in 1961, this apocalyptic environmental disaster scenario was one of the Ice Age, right? When we are living in a complete opposite scenario. And yet, if the prognosis on the Gulf Stream eventually disappearing is correct, then we might also relive the Ice Age scenario in Europe. Who knows? It's interesting for me, especially how in the work that you were talking about, this social critique of society is really placed in this environment of environmental catastrophe, as if to exemplify the existing inequalities and problems. So I would like to move on to the last speaker of today's panel, Marianna Szczygielska, who is a feminist historian of science, and she brings queer and decolonial approaches into reflection on human-animal relations. She graduated from the Central European University and also has worked as a postdoctoral scholar at Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She has written on zoological gardens and extinct or extant species. She has background in philosophy and gender studies, and works on environmental humanities, queer ecologies, and feminist science and technology studies. And she will talk today about rewilding projects as possibly utopias. So the floor is yours, Marianna.
Thanks so much, Rasa, and thank you for the invitation to this great panel. So when I received the invitation and the topic was utopias, I was trying to think how my research that is really mostly about history of science and environmental history can fit into this, but then rewilding kind of immediately presented itself as like one idea that I think captures a lot of things that come up in my research. And as you said in the very beginning, utopias are about spaces and spatiality and territories and territorialization, but they are also a lot about temporalities. And I think that rewilding is very interesting to look at from the perspective of temporalities of rewilding. And it is a project that is a scientific proposal, and it's this idea that nature will take over at some point, that there is a possibility of natural recovery. And as such, of course, it's a very compelling idea. It's innovative, it's hopeful, and has become recently very, very popular. You might remember during the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was a lot of this kind of news stories circulating about wildlife returning to abandoned urban areas. A lot of these stories were fake, like the dolphins did not swim in the Venice canals. Unfortunately, it was Photoshop. But it is true that when people were not as present in the streets of the cities, some animals really took advantage of that. But it doesn't mean that they were not there before. A lot of them actually were roaming the streets. So coming back to what rewilding is, it is a response to global biodiversity loss. And it is, in this sense, I think it is a kind of utopian project because it looks into the future where humans are not as present and where nature can thrive and also restore and rebuild itself from the destruction that it has endured throughout ages of human activity. As ecological restoration project, the main idea about rewilding is to reduce or remove human influence. A lot of rewilding projects are about land abandonment. So really, in this sense, it's quite a radical departure from other conservationist projects that usually propose much more control over management of natural resources and natural areas, whereas rewilding proposes like a radical abandonment. Like let's kind of retrieve human activities completely and let nature take the lead. And in this sense, it's quite influential and compelling because it really puts much more emphasis on strategies of non-human autonomy in habitat conservation. The origins of the rewilding are actually in the 70s, theories of island biogeography. There was a book from 1967 by Robert MacArthur and Edward O. Wilson that started to propose these ideas. So we can kind of trace them to scientific theories of nature conservation. But also there were quite a lot of mostly North American radical environmental advocacy groups that were also proposing rewilding as a solution to extinction, to the 6 mass extinction that we're living through now. But in this original idea by MacArthur and Wilson, rewilding was about introducing corridors. It was quite like well-established step-by-step idea that different habitats tend to be fragmented, even if we invest in classical kind of nature conservation like national parks or reserves. The fragmentation of habitats is becoming a problem, so they were proposing creating corridors for animals to move through, and they saw a quite large role of carnivores in creating a self-regulating system, an ecological system that was also quite reliant on trophic restoration. So ideas of that in ecological thinking, these different relations between species will kind of restore something that we maybe have lost. But in the way that rewilding is being practiced nowadays, a really large part is put on reintroduction of large mammals, the so-called keystone species. And actually, instead of carnivores, who tend to be quite dangerous to humans, there's much more emphasis put on large herbivores. And this is especially interesting to me because as an environmental historian, I'm looking at these past projects of restoring species that are endangered with extinction or will already extinct. So especially I focused on reintroducing the European bison and trying to backbreed the already extinct tarpan horse. And the projects that, like a lot of projects of rewilding that are active across Europe are really using those animals as keystone species at the moment. And they are sometimes called so-called part of the Pleistocene rewilding, which is an idea that if you introduce large herbivores and carnivores as well, species that might have already even gone extinct because of human activity, but you have their analogs. So maybe we don't have some of the large species that are completely extinct, like the mammoth, although there were ideas in the US to reintroduce elephants as the proxy of the extinct mammoth into the Great Plains, which might sound quite radical and definitely utopian. There's this idea of like restoring something from the past to create something new into the future. But then the question arises really, if the erasure of human history and control is even possible and desired. And I'm talking about this keystone species specifically because I focused in my research on animal history, and I started with the history of zoological gardens, which now you may know as institutions that are involved in, and their main kind of rationale is about preventing extinction by breeding captive species that are, some of them at least, are supposed to be reintroduced into the wild, whatever that is. But I also research specifically restoring the nearly or already extinct species. And I will talk about two of them today. One of them is the European bison. I think it is interesting because it shows how these animals that are so prominently used now, they're themselves kind of engineered nature. So the European bison were already part of different types of utopian thinking beyond rewilding, which is a very recent idea, because their restoration and their existence and protection in nature really fell into the imperial histories and definitely national narratives as well. So European bisons are native. Their last remnants survived in the primeval forest of Białowieża that is located between Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. And for a long time, well, that area was part of quite a lot of historical turbulences. So different nature management systems changed there quite a lot. But the European bison was always protected by the rulers, by the Polish kings or by the Russian tsars, mainly because it was a very charismatic species and a game species, so an animal that you would hunt in these spectacular, royal hunts. So it kind of enjoyed some privileges as a royal beast. But the demise of the European bison came with the World War I, and especially the later military activities. When in 1919 the European bison was officially hunted to extinction. There was no more any representative of it surviving in the wild. But very quickly after the end of World War I, different group of conservationists in Europe were gathering to restore the population of bison, because there were some surviving animals in zoological gardens spread across Europe. So the International Society for the Protection of the European Bison was officially established in 1923, and it was established in Frankfurt in Germany. But there were already voices, especially from Polish conservationists, earlier to do that, because Poland regained Białowieża primeval forest as part of its territory after the end of World War I. And bison was definitely a big concern of it was a species that was very important for the rebuilding national identity at the time. But of course, there were technical problems in restoring the bison population. There were the 1924 census of the surviving specimens said that there's 66 bison surviving in captivity, spread across around 10 countries. But only 54 of them were considered suitable for breeding, and eventually only 12 individual animals were the founding population of the current population of European bison that has been restored. And that is because a lot of those animals, even though they looked like European bison, they were not necessarily pure European bison. So these ideas about pure bloodlines, especially in the interwar period, was extremely important for the conservationists back then. So there were a lot of hybrids of the bison between the American bison, which is a close cousin, but a different species, and the domestic cows, because they can also interbreed. But they were not considered, at least by Polish scientists, they were not considered suitable for reintroduction and further breeding. And this has consequences nowadays. So if you imagine it's just 12 animals that are the founding population, it's a very small breeding pool, which means that the current population that, for example, in the Polish side of Białowieża forest, it's around 500 to 600 animals. They are very closely related to one another. So the problem of inbreeding and lack of genetic diversity right now is quite problematic. But then those bison, and they also cause a lot of human-wildlife conflict because they are enormous. If you are in Białowieża, in Teremiski or anywhere, and you might just encounter that huge 600-ton animal on your way, and then you have to heat, like it's quite a humbling experience for sure, and they get into human conflict with people quite a lot, but they are also used in rewilding projects in completely different places across Europe. How much time do you have?
5 to 10.
Whoa. Okay, 10. 10. Maybe 10. I will move to the second animal that I researched quite a lot, which is the tarpan. So if you go to, for example, Oostvaardersplassen, which is a rewilding area that is very known in the Netherlands. Okay. And in some also rewilding places in Germany, you might see signs that says, this is our tarpans running there. Really majestic, beautiful, wild horses, quite small. The problem is they are not really tarpans. They are domestic horses that were backbred in the interwar period as well. And I researched 2 different breeding projects that resulted in this horse breed that is called either the Polish konik. That's the result of the breeding project of a Polish scientist, Tadeusz Vetulani, who was interestingly quite involved here. He got his education here in Vienna. And he worked with Leopold Adamec quite a lot, who was a prominent Viennese zoologist. And another breed is so-called hack horse, which is kind of phenotypically very similar animal, but a completely different breeding project that was started by the Heck brothers in Germany that are kind of infamous for one of them being definitely a Nazi, and second one kind of a Nazi. Still unsure. But they also backbred, they also try to backbreed the tarpan by interbreeding different domestic horses breeds that were considered primitive together. Vetulani had a bit different approach. He found a horse in Galicia region over here, very poor, underdeveloped region that he considered to have characteristics of the tarpan kind of surviving in the local populations and trying to recreate them. But the long story short is that they are not really tarpans, they are resembling tarpans, and that was kind of the idea, a utopian idea of that project. But Vetulani never claimed to have really backbred the tarpan. He was quite aware that this is a domestic horse that he bred. The Heck brothers, they kind of announced the, return of the Grimme Schelch from the Nibelungenlied national epic, and the horses were released into Schofheide. There was also some other scandals involved because at the beginning of World War II, Lutz Heck pillaged the collections and the national reserve of the Polish konik in Białowieża, operated by Vetulani, and just stole specimens from him. So this is just to show how much animal species can be extremely engineered themselves as well. And as Dolly Jorgensen, an environmental historian, says herself, the recovery of nature is kind of always a nostalgic practice that looks to a historical past and relies on belonging, in this case that I talked about quite a lot, national belonging, to justify future-oriented actions. And 2 minutes, yes. Last but not least, then, I wanted to mention some of the kind of, I wanted to mention 2 rewilding projects that are quite specific, but I will just talk about one, and maybe in the discussion, if anybody wants to talk about the Oder River and the Oder rewilding project, you can ask that question. But one of the kind of major rewilding projects in practice right now is the so-called Half Earth project. I don't know if anyone has heard about that. I see some nodding, yes. So this is a project that is funded by the Edward O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and it comes from a book by late Wilson from 2016, when he came to kind of radical idea that actually to do something meaningful to counteract the current destruction of the environment and the rate at which we are losing species and biodiversity, really, we should set aside half of the Earth just for nature and remove human activity from there. Which, as you might already know, sounds quite radical, but also really problematic, because the question is, which half do we do? And if you visit the website of that project, and especially the mapping of this project, it always opens on Africa. It's like, is that a coincidence? So there is a very problematic history of nature conservation and projects like national parks, where those projects tend to be quite colonial in the way that they try to preserve nature, but by dispossessing vulnerable population, especially indigenous groups. And this troubling history of conservation as a form of governance, I think, should caution us also into the way that we envision future rewilding projects. And I do think that we do need radical steps right now, because we are in a situation where there is no turning back. But the question is maybe to challenge the notions of kind of pre-existing and pure nature in need of preservation, the so-called problem of baselines in nature conservation. And maybe the animals that deserve our attention and restoration might not be only the very spectacular and charismatic species, but also other animals, and the animals in question that might, with their history, also disrupt the tidy categorizations that we rely on. But to sum up, definitely, I will leave you with some questions, such as if you think, maybe yourselves, if a complete abandonment of human control is even possible. And whether maybe, for example, it is still worth to think about urban ecosystems as part of rewilding. So not only thinking about those areas that are already somewhat preserved or are rural. Most of those projects tend to focus on rural areas. But what about urban areas where actually biodiversity has been on the rise in comparison to heavily exploited rural lands? And I think that utopian thinking can help us to push the limits of understanding what nature is worth conserving and how nature conservation work is realized in practice, and what can we do with that. Okay, so I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianna. The end of your talk reminded me of this trend on social media to remind people that not only the spectacular birds and cute horses are worth preserving, but also the ugly animals and the useless animals, useless to people, also deserve to survive. But if a little bit more seriously, I think your talk again, at least to me, it showed how it's impossible to think about nature outside of politics anymore, and really about nature outside of human control in a way. I think that seemed to be one of your main points, if I'm not mistaken. I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience, and as well, I want to encourage you to ask questions one another, if you feel like it.